Chairman.
I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Chairman, for a short part of those two contributions to the debate, I found myself in the very unusual position of agreeing with David Bennett. Oh, no. I don't recall that happening before, actually, in the history of this Parliament. But I'm recovering a little bit from that position. And I guess the reason for that is that this bill was, in part, introduced by the Honourable Member's party. It was introduced in the bad old days when we had a national-led government. It didn't proceed to a select committee. The incoming government looked at it and said there are some provisions in this legislation that we want to see go ahead. But the new minister, the Honourable Damien O'Connor, who has had a lot more experience with the dairy industry than the member who just made a contribution, although I acknowledge his experience in the dairy industry. You should address people by their proper names, the Honourable Nathan Guy. Standing orders, page a day. The Honourable Damien O'Connor, the current minister, who has a lot of experience, in the dairy industry, said there are some provisions in this legislation that, if they don't progress through to the third reading and be passed, will mean that provisions that everyone in the House seems to agree on will expire. That's right. So that's why I'm pleased that we've seen, despite the debate that the National Party keep contributing to, that there's a lot of agreement that those provisions shouldn't expire. There is some debate about that, and that's one of the downsides of not having gone through the select committee process. But I want to raise one that's been mentioned to me, because I know it's been considered by the minister, and in his view, the positives from this legislation continued outweighed the negatives. In fact, in his view, taking away the provisions that I'm just going to refer to would not address the problem, and that is this. There are some units that are dairy farms that would, in most situations, be considered not viable. They wouldn't. Most good dairy farmers would say, that's not a place that you should have a dairy farm. It might cost too much to irrigate, it might cost too much to fertilise, it might be too far away from the pickup system. But under the dairy industry legislation, of course, Fonterra have a requirement to collect that milk. So the position that's been put to me is that we should consider that as a Parliament, and I think we should, in the way that often these issues are discussed in a more bipartisan way than many other pieces of legislation, and say, if we do have some parts of our country where we actually don't think that dairy farming is the best use of that land, but some people have started a dairy farm, and then Fonterra are required to pick up the milk, is that good? Do we want to see that continue? Now, I think that's a legitimate debate to have, and as I say, because we're progressing this bill through all stages so that the provisions we all agree on don't expire, I think as the wider review is done, the Minister's given us a clear undertaking that the wider review of the dairy industry is going to take place. I welcome the contribution from National Party members. David Bennett, who I've already acknowledged has got experience, Honourable David Bennett, apologies, who's got experience in the dairy industry. The Right Honourable David Carter, who's got a lot of experience in this House as well as in the farming community, former minister. I would welcome their contribution to that particular point. Is this a problem? Is it an issue that this Parliament should consider? Should we just leave it entirely to the market, in which case would we take away the requirement for Fonterra? And I'm not talking about for existing farms, of course, because you couldn't retrospectively change the rules. But in my view, the incentives are wrong. We are providing incentives for dairy farming in parts of the country that without that Fonterra requirement would probably not run a dairy farm. So, Mr Chairman, I'm really pleased with the progress that this bill is making. It hasn't been around the Parliament that long. It was only introduced last year by the National Government, didn't ever make it to a select committee. As I said, some provisions that were in it originally have been taken out. But to make sure that the parts that this Parliament wants to keep don't expire, this very small bill is going to progress through all stages, provided that it gets the votes that it needs. I've enjoyed listening to the debate yesterday and today. I hope that we have more contributions to it, and perhaps more than just biffing bricks at each other, talk about the actual policies that drove the introduction of this legislation in the first place, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Perhaps talk about and contribute to the policies that drove this legislation in the first place under a national-led government, and which has led us to this situation as we currently are. It seems to me that the more we are able to openly discuss policies rather than just take political point-scoring opportunities, the better off our legislation will be. We can consider the views and perspectives of other members of Parliament, particularly those who have experience and expertise in this area, and make what might be a medium quality bill even better, or, as I have seen in years gone past, a bad bill better. That's the responsibility of a Member of Parliament. I think it's one that we take pretty seriously. I know that the Honourable Nathan Guy has put in one supplementary order paper to this. I've only had a brief read of it. I don't think it will be getting the support of our party at this stage. The honourable members pulled it. Thank you. I didn't realise that. I wasn't aware of that. In fact, I just saw it on the table about half an hour ago. So we haven't then had any amendments to this legislation. Perhaps it's not big enough to amend. There's not much to it. But certainly I would welcome the opportunity to give consideration to supplementary order papers from whatever party in Parliament to make sure that as we progress this, particularly without Select Committee consideration, that we make it as good as we possibly can. Thank you, Mr Chairman.